Her brother dragged her through the street by her hair. Then the blacksmith stepped in. The hammer was in my hand when I heard her scream. Not a scream like a woman surprised by a snake in the woodpile. This was different. A sound that comes up out of a person when something's being done to them that can't be undone. I'd heard it before, once from a horse with a broken leg in a draw outside of Cheyenne, and I never forgot it. And the sound coming through the open door of my shop that Tuesday morning in May was the same species of cry. I set the hammer on the anvil. I didn't rush. A man my size doesn't rush, it doesn't look right, and it scares people who don't need to be scared. I walked to the door. Main Street of Dellard, Wyoming. 11 in the morning, sun already mean. Dust hanging in the air the way it did that time of year, thick enough to taste copper in the back of your throat. And in the middle of the street, 30 yards from my door, Clem Poole had hold of his sister Agnes by the hair. Not her arm, not her wrist, her hair. He had a fistful of it up near the crown of her head, and he was walking fast, half dragging her, her feet scrambling to keep under her, her dress tearing at the hem where it caught her heel. She had her hands up grabbing at his fist, not fighting him, just trying to take some of the weight off her scalp. Her mouth was open, but the sound had stopped, or maybe she'd stopped making it because she'd run out of air or hope. I don't know which. There were people on the boardwalks. I counted them later in my head, the way you do when something like that sits with you and won't let go. Gus Tilbert outside the feed store, leaning on his broom. Harlan Meeks in front of the assay office with a newspaper folded in his hand. 2 women from the church circle near the millinery, one of them with her hand over her mouth. Del Purcell, who called himself a deputy, standing under the awning of the jail with his thumbs in his belt. Nobody moved. Clem Poole wasn't the biggest man in the valley, but he was unpredictable the way a wet dog is unpredictable. You never knew which way he'd go. He drank hard and owed money in 3 counties and had a temper that came on sudden and cold, not hot, which is the worst kind. He had enough friends among the rougher men in town that people had learned to look away from him, the same way you learn to look away from certain things if you intend to go on living comfortably. I walked out into the street. Not fast. I want to be clear about that. I walked out the same way I walk everywhere, which is the way a man who weighs 240 and stands 6'2" has learned to walk so as not to cause a stampede every time he needs to cross a room. I was still in my apron. I had tong marks burned into the leather of it and stood up both forearms, and I hadn't shaved since Friday. I looked like what I was, a man who'd been at his forge since 6 in the morning and had no particular interest in anything except the work waiting for him back inside. Except I walked into the street and I put myself between Clem Poole and wherever he was dragging his sister to. He stopped because he had to. I was in the way. I remember the exact quality of light. High and white and hot, no shade in the middle of that street, the kind of light that makes everything look a little more itself than it usually does. Clem's face was red from the sun or the whiskey or the anger, probably all 3. Agnes had gotten her feet under her when he stopped, and she was standing now, hunched forward because his fist was still in her hair, her eyes down. Clem said, "Get out of my way, Dex." That was my name to him, Dex Hayloren. I'd shod his horses twice and made the hinges for his barn door and fixed the coulter on his plow the spring before, and the way he said it, flat, like I was an inconvenience, told me everything I needed to know about how he'd always thought of me. I said, "Let go of her hair." He looked at me the way men look at a wall they're trying to decide if they can walk through, doing the math. I've seen that look before. I've been the wall before. He said, "She's my sister and this is family business." I said, "Then conduct it somewhere I can't see it." The street was very quiet, not the natural quiet of an empty street, the held-breath quiet of people watching and pretending they're not. I could hear a horse shifting its weight at the hitching post outside the hotel. I could hear Agnes Poole breathing through her teeth. Clem said, "You want trouble?" I said, "No. I want you to let go of your sister's hair and walk the other direction. That's all I want." He stared at me another few seconds. I could see him deciding. Not the decision I would have made, but I could see him making it. That calculation men make when they're used to getting their way, when they run up against something they can't charm or bully past, and have to figure out whether they're willing to pay the price of pushing on it. He let go of her hair. He said something to her then, low, that I couldn't hear and didn't try to. Then he pointed at me and said, "You stay out of pool business, hey Lauren." And he walked past me, close enough that his shoulder grazed mine, which was deliberate, which I let happen, and he went up the street toward the saloon. I turned around and Agnes Poole was standing in the dust of Main Street with her hair half down, and her dress torn at the hem and her eyes on me. I'd seen her before. You see everyone in a town that size. She came in with Clem sometimes to pick up supplies, and once she'd come alone to ask if I could repair the latch on a trunk, which I did, and charged her nothing for it because it took 10 minutes and she looked like she couldn't spare the coins. Quiet woman, maybe 30, dark hair. A face that had some hardness in it that didn't start out there, the kind that comes from a particular kind of life. She said, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "No." She said, "He'll make it worse for me." I said, "Maybe. Do you have somewhere to go that isn't his house?" She looked at me for a second like that was the strangest question she'd ever been asked. Then she said, "No." I thought about it. I said, "Come on then." She didn't move right away. I understood that. A woman in her position has learned, at considerable cost, not to walk toward men who offer her things. I said, "I've got a storeroom behind the shop. Clean. There's a cot in there I use when I'm finishing a long job and don't want to ride home. You can stay there tonight while you figure out your next step. I'll sleep at the shop." She looked at me for what felt like a long time. Then she looked at the boardwalks, at the people who were all suddenly very interested in their own business, and something crossed her face that wasn't exactly disgust and wasn't exactly sadness, more like a recognition of something she'd known for a long time. She said, "All right." And she followed me back into the shop. I need to tell you something about what it means to be a blacksmith in a frontier town, because most people don't think about it. A doctor, a preacher, a banker, people know what those men are and what they want and what kind of man holds those jobs. But a blacksmith is invisible. He's infrastructure. He's the nails in your house and the shoes on your horse and the hinge on your gate. He's the thing you only think about when something breaks. When nothing's broken, he doesn't exist. I'd been in Dellard 9 years. I came out from Ohio after my wife died, not a dramatic story, just a fever, and then she wasn't there anymore, and Ohio had nothing left in it for me that I could identify. I heard there was a need for a smithy in the new territory towns, and I had the trade and nothing else, so I came. I built the shop with my own hands. I built the small house a quarter-mile out of town with my own hands too, and I lived in it alone. And I did good work, and people brought me their work and paid me fair. And 9 years went by like water over a flat rock, smooth and fast, and leaving very little mark. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I had my work, which I loved, and I had my tools, which were good, and I had a small garden behind the house that I tended badly but with genuine feeling. I ate my own cooking, which was not good but was adequate. I had no particular friends but no particular enemies. I was the blacksmith. That was enough. I tell you this because you need to understand that stepping into that street was not something I did for glory or out of some practiced habit of heroism. I was not that kind of man. I was a man who shod horses and made hinges. I stepped into the street because a woman was being hurt in front of me, and nobody else was going to step in, and I could not. That's the whole of it. She slept in the storeroom that night. I know she slept because I was awake most of the night in the shop. On the bench I sometimes used when the nights were hot, and the house felt too empty to justify the walk, and I could hear her breathing eventually go slow and even. I thought about Clem Pool, not with fear exactly. I'd had men threaten me before, and most of them were like Clem. They had a bark that cost them nothing and they used it freely, and then they went home and went to sleep and woke up having forgotten what they said. Men with real intentions are usually quieter about them. But I wasn't certain, and the uncertainty kept me up. In the morning, I made coffee on the small stove in the corner of the shop. She came out of the storeroom looking like she'd slept in her clothes, which she had, and she had a bruise along her hairline where he'd grabbed her, and another one on her forearm that was older, yellow at the edges, which meant it was a week or more old, which meant this wasn't a first time. I handed her a cup of coffee. She took it with both hands and stood near the door and drank it and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "How long have you been here, in Dellard?" I said, 9 years. She said, "Why'd you stay?" It was a fair question. I thought about it honestly. I said, "Work was good. I never found a reason to leave that was better than the work that was here." She looked around the shop, the anvil, the forge, the racks of tools worn shiny at the grips from use. She said, "Clem came here 4 years ago. He came because a man he owed money in Laramie was going to kill him. He said we were starting over." She didn't say anything else about that, and I didn't ask. After a while I said, "Is there family somewhere else, someone you could go to?" She said, "An aunt in Denver. I haven't written to her in 3 years. I didn't want her to know how things were." I said, "Write to her. I'll see the letter gets out on today's stage." She looked at me sideways. Not suspicion exactly. More like she was trying to understand something that didn't fit the shape of her experience. She said, "You're not going to tell me to go home and work it out with him?" I said, "No." She said, "Del Purcell told me that. Twice." I said, "Del Purcell is afraid of Clem Pool and too proud to say so. Write to your aunt." Something moved in her face then. The hardness in it shifted, not gone but rearranged. She drank the rest of her coffee and set the cup on the edge of the workbench and said, "I'll need paper." I found her paper. I found her a pen and ink. I went back to work and she sat on the stool near the door and wrote her letter while the forge heated up, and the morning got going around us, and I didn't look at her and she didn't look at me, and it was easy between us in a way I hadn't expected and didn't try to name. Clem came to the shop at mid-morning. I heard him before I saw him, his boots on the planks of the floor, the particular way he walked that I remembered from the day before. Agnes was in the storeroom by then. I'd sent her back when I heard someone on the steps, not because I was hiding her, but because I didn't want her in the middle of whatever Clem had decided to do. He came in and looked around the shop and then at me. He said, "I want my sister." I said, "She's not yours to want." His eyes went to the storeroom door. I moved so I was between him and it. Not quick, not aggressive, just moved. The way you move when you're settling your weight on ground you intend to hold. He said, "She's family, Hayloren. She belongs at home." I said, "She's a grown woman and she'll go where she chooses." He said, "You don't know what she is. You don't know what she's done." I said, "I don't need to." "Step back out the way you came, Clem." He stood there for a while. I had a hammer on the anvil and I didn't pick it up because I didn't need to, and picking it up would be a statement I didn't want to make yet. But I was watching his hands. I've learned to watch men's hands. He said low, "I'll be back with men who won't be so polite about it." I said, "Then I'll talk to them too." He looked at me for a long moment. There was something working in his face that I couldn't fully read, not just the anger, something underneath it, something almost like he was trying to understand what I was and what I wanted and couldn't get there. Men like him can't imagine a person acting without an angle, and the fact that I didn't seem to have one confused him. He left. I went to the storeroom door and knocked and said, "He's gone." She came out. She'd heard everything through the door. Her face was quiet, but her hands weren't. She was gripping her own elbows, pressing them in close. She said, "He'll do it. He'll come back with men. I said, let him. She said, you can't stand against all of them by yourself. I said, I've got the shop, 3 entrances, and I know where every one of them is. He wants to make a scene in town, or he wants to come at me quiet. If it's a scene, the whole town sees it, and even this town has a bottom to how low it'll go. If it's quiet, I'll hear them coming. She stared at me. Then she said quietly, why are you doing this? I thought about how to answer that. I'd been thinking about it since the night before in the dark of the shop while she slept. I didn't have a clean answer. I had pieces of one. I said because someone should have done it a long time ago and nobody did. And now I'm the one who knows about it. So it's mine to do. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's the most words I've heard you say at one time. I said, I don't usually have that much to say. She almost smiled. It was a small thing and it left quickly, but it was there. Clem didn't come back that day. Toward late afternoon, Jonas Hurst came by. He ran the hardware store and was about as close to a friend as I had in Dellard. Big man, soft voice, had come west from Virginia 20 years before and still talked like it. He asked me quiet, while Agnes was in the storeroom, what I was thinking. I said, I'm thinking she needed somewhere to be. He said, Clem's telling people you've taken her against her will. I said he would. Jonas said, people believe what's convenient to believe. I said people always have. Jonas was quiet for a bit. Then he said, you need anything. I said, I could use a man I trust to sit on the front steps tomorrow morning for a few hours, visibly. He looked at me, he said, I'm a hardware man, Dex. I said, I know what you are. He said, I'll be here at 8. He came back the next morning at 8, and he sat out front with his coffee, and I went on working. The letter went out on the afternoon stage. I sealed it myself and paid the fee myself and watched the stage leave. I didn't tell Agnes I'd done the second thing. She would have argued, and I didn't want the argument. She stayed 3 days. On the second day she helped me in the shop, which surprised me, not that she offered, but that she was useful at it. She'd grown up on a working spread somewhere in Kansas, she said, and she knew what a forge was and how close you stood to it and how not to stand in a man's swing when he was at the anvil. She handed me things when I needed them and held things steady when I needed that. And we worked mostly without talking, and it was the best 2 days of work I'd had in a long time. On the evening of the second day, I cooked supper at the shop. I didn't want to take her to the hotel and give Dellard more to talk about, and we ate sitting on the bench out back, where the sun was going down over the ridge in colors that never fully made sense to me. How something that indifferent can be that beautiful. She said my father was like Clem, not the same way but the same thing underneath. I said, I know that kind of man. She said Clem thinks he's protecting me. That's the worst of it. He genuinely thinks he is. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. She said I had a husband for 2 years. He died, typhus. After that I had nobody but Clem. And by then I knew Clem well enough to know what that meant, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. I said, you didn't know about the aunt in Denver. She said I knew. I was ashamed to go. I understood that. Some kinds of shame get heavier the longer you carry them. It doesn't mean you can set them down easy. It just means you've gotten used to the weight. I said she'll write back. She said, you don't know that. I said no, but I think she will. Agnes looked at the ridge. The colors were gone now, just the last gray light. She said, what would you have done if I'd said no, when you asked if I had somewhere to go? I said, asked you again, slower. This time the smile came and stayed a little longer. It changed her face in a way I hadn't seen before, not younger exactly, but less armored, less braced. She said, you're a strange man, Dex Hayloren. I said, I know. Clem came back on the third morning. He came with two men I knew, Russ Gable, and a young hand called Petrie who worked out at the Danner spread. Not dangerous men, exactly, but men who would do what Clem asked if Clem was buying their drinks. I was at the forge when they came in. I heard the 3 sets of feet, and I knew from the sound what this was. I turned around and they were standing inside the door, spread out a little the way men do when they've agreed beforehand who stands where. Clem in the middle, Gable to his left, Petrie to the right and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, which I noted and filed away. Clem said, "I'm not leaving without her this time." I said, "She's not here." He said, "I don't believe you." I said, "That's your right, but she's not here. She left yesterday morning." This was true. I'd sent her to stay with Berta Sims, the widow who kept the boarding house on the east end of town, because I'd known Berta for years and trusted her, and because I'd had the feeling something like this morning was coming. Agnes had gone there with her small bag, and Berta had put her in a room in the back, and that was where she was. Clem didn't believe me. He looked around the shop. He looked at the storeroom door. I said, "Look if you want." He went and opened the storeroom. He looked in. The cot was there, the blanket folded. Agnes had folded it before she left, which I noticed for no reason except that you notice things, and there was nothing else that was hers. He turned around. He was angrier because I was right, and men like Clem don't manage being wrong well. He said, "Where'd she go?" I said, "I don't know." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "This isn't over." I said, "I know." He left. Gable left. Petrie stopped at the door and looked back at me and said quietly, "I'm sorry about this, Mr. Hayloren." And then he left too. I went back to the forge. 2 weeks passed. Clem made noise in town. He told people I'd corrupted his sister. He told people I'd interfered in family business that wasn't mine. A few men who depended on him for things, range access, certain favors he'd cultivated, sided with him openly, and some others just went quiet the way people go quiet when they don't want to pick a side and don't know how to say so. But something else happened too. The women in town mostly. They started looking at me different, not the way I'd been looked at before as a convenience, as a necessary piece of the town's machinery, just different. Berta Sims nodded at me in the street, a real nod, the kind that means something. Dorothy Weiss, who ran the dress shop and had never in 9 years said more than was necessary to conduct business, stopped me one morning and said, "What you did was right," and walked on before I could respond. Gus Tilbert, who'd been standing outside the feed store with his broom when it happened, came to the shop a week later with a wheel that needed new iron on the rim. He set the wheel against the wall and sat down on the bench and told me straight that he was ashamed he hadn't moved. He said it plainly, without excuse. I told him I didn't hold it against him, and I didn't, because shame that a man can name is shame he might do something with. And there was one other thing. Del Purcell, the deputy, came by on a Thursday afternoon. He came when the shop was empty, and he looked uncomfortable from the moment he walked in. He said he'd heard about Clem threatening to come back with men, and he said if that happened again, I should come get him. I looked at him. He said, "I know. I know how that sounds." I said, "It sounds like what it is." He said, "I'm telling you I'll do it different next time." I thought about that, then I said, "I'll remember you said so." He left and I didn't fully trust him, but I filed it away. A man saying he'll do better is not nothing. It's not a lot, but it's not nothing. Agnes came to the shop on a Thursday, 18 days after I'd sent her to Berta's. She came in the afternoon when the work was lighter and knocked on the open door frame, which was something people didn't usually do, they just walked in, and I liked that she knocked. She was dressed better than she'd been before. Berta had seen to that, I learned later, had found some things of her own daughters that she didn't use and pressed them on Agnes, the way Berta did things, which was quietly and without making anyone feel the debt. She said, "I got a letter from my aunt." I set down what I was holding. She said she wants me to come. She says she's been worrying about me. She says she didn't know how to write first. She stopped. She says there's room for me and she'd be glad of the company. I said, when are you going? She said, the stage goes Sunday. I nodded. She said, I wanted to thank you. I've been trying to find the right way to say it and I don't think there is one, so I'll just say it plain. You didn't have to do any of it. The stepping in, the storeroom, the letter, sending me to Berta's. None of it was your obligation. I said no. She said, why did you? I'd been asked that before and I'd given her an answer. This time she was asking for something more, and I think we both knew it. I thought about how to be honest without making it more than it was or less. I said, I've been in this town 9 years and I've been the blacksmith. That's what I've been. Nothing else. I'm not complaining about it. It's good work and this is a good shop and I built it right and I'm proud of it. But I've spent 9 years being the thing that's useful when something breaks and then goes back to being invisible. And I stepped out of that shop and into that street, and for 10 seconds I was something other than invisible. I stopped. It didn't feel bad. She was quiet for a while. The shop had that late afternoon sound to it, the light coming in at a low angle through the side window, dust moving in it, the horses out on the street, far off and easy. She said, you've been alone a long time. I said, yes. She said, so have I. She looked at me then, not the sideways look she'd given me before, not assessing or guarded. Straight at me, the way you look at something you've decided about. She said, I'm going to Denver on Sunday, but I don't know that I'll stay there. My aunt's old and her house is small and Denver's a city, and I'm not a city woman. I said, all right. She said, I might want to come back. I said carefully, there's no shortage of work in Dellard for a person willing to do it. She said, that's not what I meant. The afternoon was very still. I said, I know what you meant. She held my eyes. Then she crossed the shop floor 8 steps. I counted them without meaning to, and she put her hand against my chest, flat over the heart, not embracing me, just placing her hand there. And she looked up at me and I looked down at her and there was nothing that needed saying. I put my hand over hers. She said, I'll write when I get there. I said, I'll write back. She said, don't let anyone drag me into the middle of that street again. I said, I won't. She left. I stood in the shop alone for a while with the afternoon going on around me and the fire in the forge banking down to coals, and I thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. The way you do when something has shifted in you that you didn't expect, and you're not sure yet what shape it's going to take. She wrote from Denver 3 weeks later. Not a long letter. Agnes wasn't a long letter woman, which I'd already suspected. She wrote that the aunt was glad to have her, and that Denver was loud and had more people in it than she'd expected, and that she'd found a job helping at a dry goods store. She wrote that the mountains looked different from Denver than they looked from the east, wider somehow, and that she thought about the ridge behind the shop sometimes in the evenings. She wrote one more thing at the end, without building up to it the way most people would, which was very like her. She wrote that she wanted to come back to Dellard in the fall if I was still there, and if the offer was what she thought it was. I wrote back the same day. I wrote that I was still there. I wrote that I expected to be there in the fall and the winter after that, and as far out as I could see. I wrote that the offer was exactly what she thought it was, and that she should take her time in Denver and come when she was ready and not before. I wrote that the town was quieter without her. The last part wasn't strategy, it was the truth. Clem left Dellard in August. I heard it from Jonas. He'd sold the house and land at a loss to a man from Casper and just gone. Nobody knew where. Nobody asked too hard. The Danner spread bought 2 of his horses, and a man named Briggs took the grazing land on the north end, and that was all Clem left behind. A couple of transactions, and a vacancy that the town filled over the next few weeks the way a creek fills a hole in its bed. quietly and without ceremony. I thought about him some, not with much. I tried to work out what I felt about Clem Poole, and the best I could arrive at was something close to pity, which felt strange in my mouth, and I let it go. A man who can only make himself feel large by making others feel small is already in a kind of prison. He'll carry it with him wherever he goes. That wasn't my problem. There was an afternoon in September, late September, the aspens just starting, when I was shaping a set of gate hinges and I heard the stage come in. I didn't stop what I was doing. The stage came in 3 times a week and I had work to finish. But I heard it, and a few minutes later I heard boots on the steps that I recognized, the same way you recognize a voice before you hear words, something in the rhythm and the weight of it. She came through the door with a bag in each hand, and she set them down inside the entrance, and she looked at me and the shop around me and she said, "You cleaned the place up." I said, "Some." She said, "I can still smell the forge." I said, "That's never going away." She said, "Good, I like it." She looked worn from the journey, but she stood straight, the way she always did, head level, jaw quiet. There was something about her I hadn't fully seen in May, maybe because she'd been braced then, armored in a way that was necessary and now less so. She looked like herself. Whatever that meant, I could feel that it was true. I set the hinges on the anvil. I walked across the shop to where she was. I'm a large man, and I've always been aware of it in the way large men are, aware of the space I take up, careful not to let it feel like something being imposed. I stood close to her, and she didn't step back, which told me everything I needed to know, and I put my arms around her, and she put her face against my chest, and neither of us said anything. She was warm and real, and she smelled like travel and like herself underneath it, and she was in my shop where she'd said she wanted to be. Her hands were flat against my back, pulling me in, not gently, the way you hold something fragile, but with a steadiness, a certainty, like she'd made the decision, and the decision was this, and she wasn't second-guessing any part of it. I said into her hair, "You came back." She said, "I told you I might." I said, "You did." We stood there for a while. The forge was cooling for the evening. The light through the side window was the September light, long and gold, different from the summer light but maybe better. She pulled back enough to look at me. Up close she looked the same as she had in May and entirely different, both at once, the way people look when you know them better. She said, "Berta says there's a preacher in town now." I said, "Came in July. His name's Aldrich." She said, "Is he any good?" I said, "I haven't had occasion to find out." She said, "I suppose we'll see." I said, "I suppose we will." We married in October the 14th. Not a large event. Berta and Jonas Hurst and his wife and a few others who'd shown themselves to be what they were when it counted. Aldrich, who turned out to be a decent man with a plain way of speaking that I appreciated. Agnes wore a dress that Berta had helped her make, dark blue, not what you'd call a wedding color, but it was right for her. She looked like herself, and herself was exactly who I wanted standing there. I remember the weight of her hand in mine when Aldrich read the words. Her hand was not small. She'd worked too long for small hands. The knuckles were a little large, and there was a scar on the back of the right one from something she'd never told me about. I held it in both of mine and didn't think about anything except how solid it was, how real. When it was done and the small gathering had eaten and drunk what there was and begun to filter out, Agnes and I stood on the steps of the church, and Dellard was quiet in the October night, the first cold in the air, the stars out hard and white the way they get when the temperature drops. She was beside me with her shoulder against my arm, not leaning, just beside me. There's a difference. The town was the same town it had always been. Dellard, Wyoming. The feed store and the assay office and the hotel and the millinery, and the jail with its worthless deputy, and the hardware store where Jonas Hurst had spent 30 years building something solid. The same street where a woman had been dragged by the hair on a Tuesday morning in May, and nobody had moved. I'd lived here 9 years and been part of the furniture. Something had shifted, not in the town, or not mainly. In me. In what I was willing to be and what I was willing to do, and who was standing beside me while I figured it out. Agnes said quietly, "Cold." I said, "It'll get colder." She said, "I know." She put her arm through mine, and we stood there while the night settled around us, and the stars were very bright. And somewhere on the north ridge a coyote called once and went quiet, and the town of Dellard breathed in and breathed out and went on being what it was. And I was the blacksmith. And she was beside me. And that was more than enough.